Okay, we can go ahead and get started. Welcome and thank you to those who have clicked on to join us on our YouTube channel. My name is Miranda Shorts, pronouns she, her. I am the training specialist under the Training and Technical Systems team at Ujima Inc., the National Center on Violence Against Women in the Black Community. I have the pleasure of moderating this discussion with Sikivu Hutchinson. We're really excited to have you on, so thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
All righty, so today we'll be talking about how, as advocates, we can better uplift, support, and mentor Black teen survivors of dating violence. But before we get into that discussion, I do want to introduce Sikivu. So Sikivu Hutchinson, PhD, is an educator, author, playwright, and guitarist. She's the founder of Black Skeptics Los Angeles and the Women's Leadership Project, which is a Black feminist humanist mentoring and civic engagement program for girls of color in South Los Angeles. Her books include Humanist in the Hood, Unapologetically Black, Feminist, and Heretical, Imagining Transit, Race, Gender, and Transportation Politics in Los Angeles, Moral Combat, Black Atheist Gender Politics in the Value Wars, and the novel White Knights, Black Paradise on People's Temple in the 1978 Jonestown Massacre. She also wrote, directed, and produced a short film and a play adaptation of White Knights and Black Paradise, which debuted LA's Hudson Theater in 2018. Her articles have been published in the Washington Post, the Huffington Post, Religious Dispatches, the Humanist Magazine, and the LA Times. Her latest novel, Rock and Roll Heretic, The Life and Times of Rory Tharp, was published in March 2021 and debuted as a play in the Hollywood Fringe Festival in June 2022. She is also a recipient of the 2020 Harvard Humanist of the Year Award. Thank you so much for joining us. So excited to have you here.
Thanks, Miranda.
All righty, we can just jump into questions. So obviously you do such great work, so we want to hear about it. So why did you and your work feel that it was important to place the youth in leadership positions?
Well, first and foremost, I am a teen dating survivor. I'm a survivor of intimate partner violence and domestic violence, sexual violence, and sexual harassment, starting in elementary school. And when I was coming up, there were virtually no resources, no platforms, no community agency that was centered on the lived experiences and the trauma of African American girl violence survivors. And so I really felt compelled to design a program and to advocate for initiatives that are centered on our experiences with that trauma, with that turbulence, but also with the resilience and the resistance that we bring to these conversations and to our communities navigating through these issues. So that was first and foremost on my mind, that I was reflecting a lot in the early 2000s about how I just didn't have a voice. I didn't have resources. There was no language. And fast forward into the 21st century, there are voices, there is language, there obviously has been a hashtag Me Too movement reckoning that was initiated by a Black womanist feminist named Tarana Burke. But unfortunately, a lot of that dynamism is not reaching African American girls on the ground in elementary schools, in middle schools, in high schools that are really, in my mind, the epicenter for violence and trauma and anti-Black misogyny or misogynoir. And the fact that we don't have programming, sustainable programming that is endorsed by districts en masse to redress those conditions for Black girls. That often we have African American girls that are trying to connect with administrators, trying to make their trauma known to adults on campus, and they're being silenced, victim blamed, and victim shamed, and being told that their experiences with trauma are not as important as other dynamics that are happening in school communities.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that with us. And it's awesome that you kind of have paved a way for that type of programming, especially in Los Angeles. And you're right. I think a lot of Black women and girls can obviously relate to those experiences, but have never had a space to kind of talk about it or kind of formulate that language. So thank you for touching on that. beyond that, I know you talked about having that space. So, what are some narratives or behaviors that adults should maybe shift away from in order to truly support and uplift Black survivors?
I think that minimizing the experiences of Black girls, and when I say Black girls, I mean female identified youth, gender expansive youth, non binary youth, again, youth that have fluidity when it comes to their identities. That minimizing their experiences is a cardinal sin, in my view. That attempting to, we'll say, what about this or what about that? And not really being attuned to the intersectional aspects of their experiences. For example, if we're talking about Black queer girls who are gender nonconforming, being in high schools where they may be targeted based upon their dress, based upon their hair, based upon not hewing to or subscribing to or enacting so-called respectable conduct. We know that this happens time and again with African American girls across sexuality, across a gender expression. And unfortunately, some of this targeting is coming from Black adults who are attempting to impose their views of moral respectability onto African American girls and boys. So that's number one, listening to their voices, valuing their experiences, not minimizing the validity and the importance of mentoring, of integrating culturally responsive approaches into school methodology, into lesson plans, into reading lists, having youth actually step up and giving them the space to do peer education, for example. That's a really big piece of our school curricula and methodology. Peer education, allowing them to not only talk about their lived experiences in their community context, but how does this connect to social histories of dehumanization and anti-Black misogyny that African American women have experienced since the Middle Passage and enslavement and Jim Crow. Very important to ensure that there is this connection between contemporary experiences that Black youth are having and that trajectory, that social history.
Right, absolutely. You kind of touched on dehumanization a little bit, and alluded to adultification through, that policing of their bodies through dress code, other vague offenses under that, respectable conduct. So in your work, how have you kind of seen that adultification impact perceptions of dating violence or teen relationships for Black youth specifically?
There's one anecdote that really stands out to me that I had a young person in our Women's Leadership Project program who talked about being on the outskirts of a fight that had broken out at their high school. And this was after school. So this young woman was watching a fight go down, and there were tons of school police who descended to apprehend the perpetrators in that particular melee. But this young woman was also swept up in that and handcuffed simply for being on the scene, being in a Black female body, and perhaps maybe questioning what was going down. But she was not participating in any of the physical altercations that were transpiring. And yet she was handcuffed and hauled away. And so what she told us after that incident occurred was that had she been a white girl, she would have been given Starbucks and some Uggs. She would have had a full complement of intervention resources to help her with that trauma, that there would have been counseling, there would have been some form of care administered to her in the wake of that trauma. And so we constantly see that African American girls at a very, very young age, I mean, we know that Black girls as young as preschool age are targeted, are viewed as not being innocent, are viewed as not even being children. and thus the high rates of suspension, expulsion, and push out. I think the numbers are as appalling as 40% of preschoolers who are suspended and expelled are African American. We know that Black girls overall are 4 to 6 times more likely to be suspended, expelled, bounce out of school than are non-Black girls. So these are some of the really grave and insidious implications of adultification. With regard to specific experiences in our school context, I see that Black girls are again underserved when it comes to therapy interventions, that we do not have culturally competent Black women therapists, licensed clinical social workers, psychiatric social workers in our schools, that there's a crisis when it comes to providing that kind of care and actually having those practitioners in the pipeline to see our youth, to have these conversations, that restorative justice, as we know, is under attack in our schools, that there may be a token effort in school districts to implement restorative justice programming, have a coordinator or coordinators, ideally, who are available on a consistent basis, and to connect that programming with during school and after school enrichment that is specifically geared towards addressing the trauma that Black girls, the Black female identified and gender expansive and queer youth are experiencing. So that's a really tall order. But circling back to your original question, this is the structural impact of adultification of Black girls. And we certainly see it played out in the very granular interpersonal exchanges that Black girls have in classrooms when it comes to academics, that African American girls are stifled when they're trying to speak, that there is not care that is being given to African American girls who may be talking about ritualized sexual harassment, ritualized sexual violence, ritualized intimate partner and dating violence, the use of extremely toxic, insidious, and misogynist language that calls Black girls out of their name, that identifies them first and foremost as sexual objects, as bitches, as hoes, as thoughts, as sluts. I mean, there's a whole um, panoply of different terms that Black girls are ritualistically called and labeled. And this becomes part of the normalized culture of our school communities.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, I've seen it firsthand. I've experienced it. And as you said, this adultification and this type of labeling really lends itself to that criminalization, and honestly to the hyper surveillance of by teachers themselves of Black girls in school, just beyond like CPOs and officers. You see it with teachers as well, right? So you can really see that lack of care awarded to Black girls in school. And with that story you shared, you can also very clearly see that Black youth are nearly aware of how they are adultified in those contexts. And so I wanted to ask, how does adultification impact the ways in which Black teens and youth receive that support when they need it?
Yeah, what I see is a lack of consistency. So, for example, there was a young person who was being cyberbullied. In addition to the bullying started out on social media, and she was queer identified, but not explicitly out. And so there were a lot of folks that were casting aspersions and projecting an identity onto her that she had not explicitly claimed. She went to a counselor, talked about it, was trying to also navigate through domestic violence that she was experiencing in her home. And we attempted to engage her in our programming because we provide one of the few queer affirming, Black affirming, Black self-determining spaces at this particular school that this youth was at. And it just dropped off the radar because there was not, again, an intersectional understanding of the crisis that this particular student was experiencing, not just with peers, but also with invisibility at the school community. That far too often there is this emphasis at Black and Latinx dominated schools on racial justice, rightfully so. But what drops out of the equation is the lived experiences and the disparities that queer and female identified youth are navigating in our own communities, whether or not we're talking about being disproportionately religious and projecting homophobia and transphobia onto Black, queer, and BIPOC youth and making them feel less safe, um, precipitating them leaving home, becoming unhoused, becoming disproportionately sex trafficked, not having avenues beyond being pipelined into prisons and juvenile facilities and sexual abuse. So there's a lot of work to be done when it comes to being aware of the nexus of trauma and the nexus of resiliency and identities that our youth are bringing to school communities. And certainly that impacts, vis-a-vis your original question, that nexus of adultification is a really big part of that with regard to the bodies and the sense of subjectivity that African American girls are bringing to school communities.
Right. Yeah. Teens and youth, as you said, inevitably will bring that, trauma to school with them. And so how are we showing up for them is really important in that question. And also thank you for bringing it up and touching on that intersectional aspect of support systems, because I think that's something that is also looked over as well. And so within your work, so what are some culturally specific strategies you specifically use in your work to support Black teens and youth?
So I mentioned peer education before, and that's been a cornerstone of our work, that we cannot do this work without listening to the voices of youth, lifting them up in any way that we can, and providing them with resources to exercise leadership in their school communities. So, for example, the youth initiated a Standing for Black Girls task force right after the pandemic was declared, because what we were seeing and experiencing is that African American girls were disproportionately impacted when it came to being caregivers around the clock, being at home and being victimized by sexual violence and domestic abuse and intimate partner violence, not having safe spaces to navigate through that, not having counselors, being saddled with adult responsibilities at disproportionate rates. And so some of our students did a survey with about 150 youth in their South LA community. And the predominant response to that survey was that African American girls who were survivors of domestic violence and sexual violence were not receiving intervention. They weren't connected to counselors. They weren't connected to any programming designed to redress the trauma that they had experienced. And so what came out of that was the Standing for Black Girls Task Force, where our youth are actually spearheading public policy engagement with local policymakers like Supervisor Holly Mitchell, African American woman supervisor in LA County in District 2, which encompasses South LA. And there are three key issues in the task force are reproductive health and reproductive justice, mental health and wellness, and job creation or workforce development. And so as a result of that task force originating again in 2021, we were able to initiate a Standing for Black Girls wellness initiative that connects African American girls, female identified youth, and queer youth to Black and BIPOC culturally competent and culturally responsive and humanist therapists and practitioners here in South LA. And so we got a grant to do that. The program is going into its second year, and that has been extremely helpful for our youth in this pandemic, post-pandemic phase. That's one item. Another item is connecting them to mentors, having a space where our youth can actually engage with professional African American women mentors, African American female identified and queer mentors who are in the arts, who are doing writing projects, who are in the mental health and wellness field, being able to do LGBTQ plus youth of color and Black youth institutes in our community that are facilitated by our youth. Being able to connect our youth to college mentors, young people who have graduated from our partner schools but are still engaged in WOP and Standing for Black Girls activities, coming back to schools to mentor high school age youth. Providing scholarships is a really important one, and not just one-off scholarships. Those are good too, but having multi-year scholarships for young people that are coming back and serving the community. Our first generation college students, that's critically important because we know first generation college students, particularly queer, unhoused, undocumented, and foster care and system involved first generation college students are less likely to graduate from college. So they need multi-year reinforcement to ensure that they are able to matriculate and graduate successfully. We also do a lot with reproductive justice outreach, as I mentioned before. We have a partnership with Planned Parenthood Los Angeles, based in Inglewood, predominantly serving Black and Latinx populations across gender, across sexuality. So one of the things that we did in 2021 in partnership with the supervisor in Department of Mental Health and Department of Public Health here in LA County is push for a well-being center in one of our partner schools. And so that is now up and running as a result of the advocacy of the young people in part of the Standing for Black Girls Collaborative.
That's great. Excuse me. You're right. Survivors, as you mentioned early on, adults or not, will always tell you what they need, right? So letting them lead is crucial to any form of advocacy. And thank you for bringing up something that has a centered focus on post-pandemic response. COVID-19 has definitely had a pretty big impact on our teens and youth, and I don't think a lot of programs really address that specifically because COVID, whether we recognize it or not, definitely did a number on everybody. And we're not necessarily in a post-pandemic world yet. So yeah, thank you for bringing that up. And I know you mentioned peer education, but beyond that, are there any strategies that your organization specifically use that adults might not initially think of when they're thinking of responses to supporting teens and youth?
Yeah, absolutely. Two that are really integral to our approach is giving our youth a platform to write, to publish, to do art, to have conversations among themselves on podcasts. So since 2021, we've had a fairly robust contribution to our WLP blog. We have young people that are writing about everything from their experiences with sex trafficking and the stats associated with that vis-a-vis Black girls, to colorism, to mental health disparities in our community, to the Black Lives Matter movement, to reproductive justice. So there are a number of different ways that youth can plug in to these platforms that allow them to articulate their lived experiences, things that they see going on in the community, and to really amplify their activism. They have been really critical to our community rallies that we have 2 and 3 times a year. We have a Standing for Black Girls rally that specifically focuses on the disproportionate numbers of African American women and girls who go missing nationwide, who have been abducted, who are victims of gun homicide and other forms of homicide. So they're active participants in the planning and execution of that rally, and also bringing in young Black women entrepreneurs. We always feature Black women who have started their own businesses, who are Gen Z, who are millennials, who are doing things in the community, giving back. So that's a really big part of it. The podcast is something that I want to shout out, that they've been doing that since I think late 2021, and that is their own baby. They run with that. They do the script, they do the editing, they bring in guests, they obviously facilitate the conversations, put the artwork together, the music. So there are a lot of different multidisciplinary approaches that we employ to engage youth, to amplify their voices, to empower them, and to connect them with folks in the community that are also pushing change with regard to anti-Black misogyny, Black womanism, and feminist holistic practices.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for mentioning the platforms of artistic expression, right? Artistic expression is a form of storytelling for a lot of people. And I think it really allows Black survivors to kind of reassert their own agency. And for the Black community specifically, it's been, such a long-standing method of community bonding and healing. So I think that is really important to bring up. So in terms of your program, if someone say they wanted to replicate the work that you do in their own community, what are three main things that they should be aware of when trying to start a program like this?
Yeah, and actually, in response to that question, I jotted down the three things, and these are three caveats. Actually, I mean, I can
Okay.
emphasize positive things at the end of this response, but my caveats are that there's a lack, and this has been a recurring theme, obviously, in our discussion. There's a lack of community support for this kind of work. There is systematic pushback against this kind of work,
Absolutely.
not just amplifying the experiences of victims and survivors, but just amplifying Black girls, amplifying Black young women. That if we label ourselves unapologetically as Black feminists and Black womanists, that elicits a toxic response, that there is stigma attached to that. We know that historically. We read the words of the Kamhi River Collective, and they break it down quite explicitly what the implications of simply naming ourselves and claiming our space and speaking our truth, what those implications are. And so I see it, we see it on an everyday basis in these school communities where Black girls are not so subtly told to step back, to take a seat, to not take up space, to not speak. And if you have an experience, for example, with religious based sexual trauma, domestic violence, or intimate partner violence, then you are especially told to sit down and take a seat and be silent and be invisible. And so our program explicitly addresses that. We're a humanist program. We emphasize non-faith based approaches because a lot of our youth and a lot of our people have identified that as being a source of trauma, and they are seeking alternative modes of redress and healing. So we're one of the few spaces that provide that and allow youth to actually be critically conscious about some of the toxic messaging that they might have gotten from coming from religious backgrounds. Um, Another thing to be mindful of is the lack of intersectionality in a lot of these spaces. And being a parent to a 14-year-old who is non-binary and being in a lot of parent serving spaces, parent community spaces. And when I bring up the fact that we have skyrocketing rates of depression, of anxiety, of suicidal ideation, of suicide amongst our Black queer youth, this is met with pushback. When I'm suggesting that we need to have specific Black LGBTQ plus affirming practices employed, not just by having safe spaces for queer youth, not just by having gender and sexuality alliances, and those are extremely valuable, but specific spaces that focus on what Black queer youth are experiencing in these intersections of being over policed, of being hyper criminalized, of being targeted for transphobic and homophobic and misogynist abuse and harassment on social media and in real time, in churches, in faith based institutions, in our families. These are extremely devastating issues that unfortunately are not being incorporated into a lot of the methodology that focuses on culturally responsive practices for Black youth. The other caveat is, and this is part and parcel of what I've been saying, the intractability of Black patriarchy and the fact that we're not allowed to actively engage boys and male identified youth about their complicity in domestic and intimate partner violence, sexual harassment, and sexual violence, but also their victimization by it. That's an extremely nascent dynamic in our schools. Being able to and having the resources to connect with boys and include them in these conversations, in these interventions, and in these spaces where we're trying to employ a Black feminist, womanist prevention lens and methodology that encompasses all genders, that acknowledges that Black men and boys are also survivors of this toxic, ritualized culture of abuse and violence, and that we see them projecting abuse and violence because they're part and parcel of this regime. So those are the caveats. As far as replicating the work, employing strategies that are concrete and that are impactful, being able to connect with like-minded Black female identified practitioners is critical. We were able to get our start because I had a mentor who was absolutely unapologetic in her advocacy for this programming. And she was in a position of power to make it happen and to ensure that we got funding, to ensure that we got in the schools where Black girls were overrepresented when it came to those who were being targeted with suspension and expulsion and criminalization, and that we were able to connect to other like-minded practitioners that could ensure the sustainability of this programming. And I'm not going to sugarcoat and to be Pollyannish, and it has been difficult. It's been very, very difficult because of all the barriers that I just invoked. But I think that if folks are able to, again, find allies, to find accomplices, and to keep pushing, to write and to publish, that's really important. Ensure that the youth voices are out there, but also the adults are reinforcing and backing up their narratives. These are strategies that can be replicated.
Yeah, wow. I have absolutely nothing to say. You really you really hit it on the nose. Critical consciousness, intersectionality. Really, I think, like, how do we engage men and boys in ending violence? That is the question. How do we get them to recognize their own victimization within the system? Like, these are all questions that need answers. But you really did touch on it. And thank you for not sugarcoating, because you're absolutely right. So I guess my final question for you is, finally, like, what are some ways that we can better engage and encourage participation from Black teens? Because I know sometimes that is difficult.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say being mindful of the multiple challenges that they face, being mindful of the gifts and the assets that they bring to this work, allowing them to talk about what's happening in their daily lives, what's happening with their relationships, what's happening with their friendships, being that ear for them. I'm constantly in contact with my youth, sometimes on an hourly basis. Someone wants to connect with a counselor. someone experienced something that is extremely disturbing and traumatic with a teacher. Someone is failing a class. Someone needs a letter of recommendation. I mean, now I'm in the throes of doing letters of recommendation, not just for my high school seniors that are off to college, but also for my mentees that are already in college and that are going on to graduate school or going on to career opportunities. So being available for them as a non-judgmental adult and mentor, emphasis on the non-judgmental, and I'm a parent, and so I know that can sometimes be a struggle,
Mhm.
but really being that kind and compassionate leader and ear that we wanted when we were growing up, and many of us did not have.
Yeah. I
In
think,
addition to, I will say, being mindful of how connected they are to the virtual sphere and to social media.
yeah, no, that's true. I think things are constantly changing. I have a sibling who's 15 and they are so much more connected than I am, and I'm only 22, so like I imagine that it's just going to keep, but right, you're right. Young people are the future and they're a gift to this world, and I think it's really important that we imagine how we can change the world that ourselves if we give them a platform to do so and give them that voice.
Right. And
Yeah.
then one more thing, sorry.
No, yeah.
We're really, really big on culturally responsive Black affirming literature.
Hmm.
Really big. And so one of the pitfalls, obviously, of digital and virtual natives and that whole dynamic and regime is
Yeah.
that there's not as much connection to sitting down, having that quiet meditative space to read.
Hmm.
And my preference as a Gen Xer is doing that with an actual book, an actual hard copy book. And so that may be difficult for a lot of our youth to navigate because they've grown up being on screens, being like umbilically attached almost to these screens. But we're having a book club tomorrow on George M. Johnson's seminal work, All Boys Aren't Blue, Black Queer Memoir Manifesto, and connecting multi-generationally. So we'll have some of our older, some of our elders, our senior sages from the baby boom generation, and quasi senior sages from the Gen X generation, and our millennials and Gen Zs engaged in that discussion. But absolutely being able to put Black literature front row and center, be it young adult literature to Harlem Renaissance era literature, really important for us.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with you. Um, but yeah, I think that's a really great point. I have nothing to say. This conversation has been really great. Thank you for being a mentor. And thank you so much for meeting with me to chat. I had such a wonderful time learning more from you about the work that you do. So thank you.
Thank you, Miranda. I really appreciate it.